Rationality and violence. As can be inferred from the examples presented in the previous section, insurgent leaders must often make choices regarding the appropriate level and targets of violence. Such decisions regarding target selection and violence intensity can be highly consequential to the group. The difficulty of deliberating through such consequential choices typically imposes significant cognitive demands on the part of insurgent leaders and counterinsurgent coin forces arrayed against them. Wendt noted, quote, "Insurgent warfare is a thinking man's game in the extreme. To be successful, coin forces must take the initiative, carefully choose their actions, weigh possible actions against the band of excellence, and anticipate the adversary's reaction. An effective coin strategy initiates actions that fall within the band of excellence, but cause the opponent to react with actions that fall outside of the band." End quote. The language used by Wendt in this passage is highly consistent with what is known within the social sciences as the rational choice perspective. This perspective argues that in important decision-making situations, individuals select choices to maximize gains or utility by relying on rational cost-benefit calculations that tie means to ends, irrespective of the nationality, ethnicity, race, gender, religion, or other form of identity of the decision-maker. Because irregular warfare scenarios impose a requirement of at least some level of rationality on the part of key decision-makers, to include insurgent leaders, government and military officials, and concerned populations, to set the stage for the rest of the report, we now turn to a brief discussion of the relevance and applicability of rational choice theory to decision-making in unconventional conflicts. McCormick used the term strategic frame to describe one perspective through which to understand terrorist groups' decision-making. This mode of analysis is essentially the application of rational choice theory to the analysis of decisions made by leaders of terrorist groups, and the discussion surrounding the strategic frame itself can be expanded to encompass uses of violence other than terrorist acts. As noted by McCormick, quote, "Terrorism in this strategic frame view is an instrumental activity designed to achieve or help achieve a specified set of long-run and short-run objectives. Like any such strategy, it is forward-looking and consequential, in the sense that the decisions to use terrorism and the nature of the terrorism that is used are based on the anticipated consequences of current actions. It is also preference-based, in the sense that alternative courses of action are evaluated in terms of their respective impact on terrorist objectives. The decision to act or not act in this view depends on the answers to 4 questions. What alternative courses of action are available? What are the expected effects of each of these alternatives? How are these expected effects likely to influence group objectives? What decision rule will be employed to decide among the alternatives? Stripped down to its essentials, the terrorist decision-making process in the strategic view is one of constrained optimization. Terrorist organizations attempt to either maximize their expected political returns for any given level of effort or minimize the expected costs necessary to achieve a specified set of political objectives." End quote. Additionally, insurgent leaders contemplating the use of violence must also develop estimates of the likelihood of different potential actions other key actors might take, as well as the impact of those actions. Hence, quote, "What this implies, for our purposes, is that a terrorist group's decision to act or not act, a decision that includes its choice of targets, tactics, and timing, is influenced by the decisions of its opponents, of its political constituency, and of any other actors that influence its strategic environment. As the French geographer Vidal de la Blache observed in 1926, an organization's environment imposes permissive and limiting conditions that shape its incentives, its opportunities, and the short and long-run consequences of its actions." End quote. Andrew Kidd and Barbara Walter, in their article on The Strategies of Terrorism, noted that a government's past behavior regarding its use of violence and concessions forms important information that can be used to formulate beliefs about likely future behaviors. Such prior probabilities of likely government action in turn can be updated as a confrontation unfolds. Ami Petitjour, in his book Suicide Terrorism, also emphasized the strategic frame in his analysis of a group's decisions to use terrorism. Quote, "The preference for suicide terrorism on the part of terrorist organizations is a consequence of advanced planning and informed assessment of other alternatives, as each one of the organizations calculates how it can further its goals vis-à-vis a number of targeted publics. These three publics are the stronger opponent, the public the organization seeks to represent, and the local political rivals." End quote. Additionally, speaking of Hamas's decision to begin using suicide terrorism in the early 1990s, Petitjour noted, quote, "In their view, violence is a means and not an end, and the decision whether to use violence or not, and if so, which tactic should be chosen, is an outcome of the anticipated benefits inherent to each method of operation." End quote. Dr. Lawrence Kushner, in the article Rationality, Wars, and the War on Terror, noted that rational choice theory has assumed a canonical role over the last century in the field of microeconomics, and he noted that its key elements include the following: collective economic phenomena, prices, national accounts, production efficiency, are the result of the individual decisions of autonomous decision-makers. Individuals have full knowledge of their preferences. Individuals have full knowledge of the resources they have to satisfy their desires. Individuals maximize their satisfaction or utility by optimally allocating their scarce resources to alternative ends. Individuals possess all the capabilities for calculating how to optimally allocate their resources. And individuals are concerned only with maximizing their own utility. They are unconcerned with how poorly or well others are doing. While these key elements pertain to the economic decisions of individuals, they can potentially also be applied to the decision calculus of insurgent leaders and coin forces attempting to make optimal decisions given existing political, economic, social, diplomatic, and military constraints. Kushner noted that these key aspects represent idealizations. For instance, individuals, including insurgent leaders, never possess perfect information about everything they need to know to behave optimally, and no decision-maker possesses the cognitive complexity to always behave optimally when faced with highly complex problems. Nonetheless, the strategic frame or rational choice paradigm may offer a useful starting point through which to analyze insurgent decisions on violence intensity and target selection. From this perspective, the use of violence is seen as the product of a cost-benefit calculation, in which the tactic of violence used against a selected target is deemed as the most effective way of achieving a desired end state. Social scientists sometimes use the phrase "state of the world" to represent a potential future end state, and this term signifies the political, economic, social, diplomatic, and military conditions extant within a political locality at some point in the future. Hence, from a rational choice perspective, the use of violence by insurgent groups may be seen as a rational means for achieving a desired state of the world at some point in the future. There are various examples that show that a rational choice perspective can be useful to understanding insurgent decision-making. We have already seen how the JVP escalated its use of violence in August 1989 against the family members of personnel in Sri Lanka's armed forces. Mick Moore, in an article on thoroughly modern revolutionaries assessing the JVP in Sri Lanka, noted that prior to this event, the group waged a widespread campaign of economic sabotage that featured enforced strikes, disruptions to the transportation and health sectors, and a disruption in economic activity in general, yet it refrained from attacking the country's tea plantations, which were a significant source of foreign exchange. A rational choice perspective may help illuminate the JVP's decision-making with respect to targeting. Specifically, Moore argued that the only plausible explanation for the group's sparing of the plantations was that it feared the public's reaction to the anticipated widespread economic devastation such an attack would generate. The JVP's ideal state of the world entailed an overthrown and replaced government with society, politics, and economics reorganized along Marxist-Leninist lines. Although the group recognized that one potential tactic to achieve this end state was an attack that would cripple the country's main exporting industry, before August 1989, the group likely concluded that the consequences of attacking the tea plantations made this tactic too costly to undertake. It was only after the JVP had likely reasoned it had used all other tools at its disposal and following the issuance of the death threat against the families of armed forces personnel, which subjected the group to existential duress, that the JVP actually did attack the plantations in the fall of 1989. The JVP's decision to issue the death threat can also be analyzed using a cost-benefit calculus. Moore noted that the group had scored successes against the government by the summer of 1989 and was looking for a knockout blow. Additionally, it was aware of the unreliability of the armed forces and their lack of interest in fighting the JVP, as opposed to fighting the LTTE, and the group hoped that many members of the Army would desert and take their weapons with them to defend their families, thus precipitating a collapse of the institution. Thus, the group likely reasoned that the benefits of issuing the death threat outweighed any potential costs. In this case, its decision regarding target selection, taken to achieve a desired future end state, proved disastrously incorrect. Hence, when considering the applicability of the strategic frame or rational choice theory, it is useful to keep in mind that insurgent leaders and other decision-makers more generally may be regarded as rational in a weak sense. They judge means by their expected impact on the likelihood of achieving desired ends. Simply engaging in a cost-benefit analysis and attempting to anticipate the reactions of opponents and divine future end states does not guarantee that errors in judgment will not be made. Another interesting example, also from Sri Lanka, involves the previously mentioned LTTE decision to assassinate Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi. While in office in 1987, Gandhi essentially imposed a peace treaty that required the Sri Lankan government to make significant concessions to its Tamil minority in return for the disarmament of Tamil militant groups, including the LTTE. The LTTE ultimately did not disarm, and the group waged a 2-year insurgency against deployed Indian troops, which were ultimately withdrawn. Although Gandhi was defeated in parliamentary elections in December 1989, the LTTE carried out the assassination in May 1991 over fears he would return to power, reintroduce troops, and enforce the peace treaty, which would require the LTTE to abandon its dreams of an independent Tamil state on the island. The intense backlash against the assassination, which resulted in the loss of Tamil Nadu as an operational and logistical base, suggests that the LTTE may have miscalculated in its initial assessment of the utility of the operation. Indeed, years later, the group's chief negotiator and theoretician, Anton Blassingham, rued the decision to assassinate Gandhi. Quote, "As far as that event is concerned, I would say it is a great tragedy, a monumental historical tragedy for which we deeply regret, and we call upon the government of India and the people of India to be magnanimous, to put the past behind, and to approach the ethnic question in a different perspective." End quote. One may be forgiven in thinking that a rational choice perspective implies that history is linear or efficient, with decision-makers weighing different one-time actions that most effectively shift the state of the world to a more desirable end state, after which history ends. Instead, history may be viewed as a cycle of repeated interactions between different participants, with no clear terminal end state. Addressing Vladimir Putin's strategy toward Ukraine in July 2014, a writer for The Economist observed, quote, Mr. Putin's apparent interest in an on-again, off-again cycle of ceasefires and negotiations suggests that he would like to lock the conflict in place, legitimizing the so-called People's Republics in Donetsk and Luhansk and raising the profile of these rebel commanders ready to take orders from Moscow. Such a war, oscillating between open fighting and political talks, but without ever being completely resolved, would resemble other frozen conflicts around the former Soviet Union. In Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and Transnistria, unsettled but largely bloodless conflicts serve to constrain the Georgian and Moldovan governments, as well as providing a built-in lever for frequent Russian meddling." End quote. Similarly, as part of an exercise of rational deliberation, decision-makers may also place greater value on long-term rather than short-term end states. Leaders of Hamas and other Palestinian insurgent groups may be adopting a time horizon that spans decades into the future, when the demographic balance in Israel, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip has already shifted in favor of the Palestinians. By this time, international pressure on Israel to reach a settlement in favor of the Palestinians may prove insurmountable. From this perspective, violent and nonviolent actions employed by Hamas against Israel could be viewed as efforts by the group to position itself in what it sees as a likely future sometime in the next 10 to 20 years. A number of authors regard non-elites within a population as rational decision-makers in a weak sense, who engage in careful cost-benefit calculations when deciding whether to support a resistance movement or an incumbent government. In a much-cited study, Samuel Popkin, in The Rational Peasant, argued that Vietnamese peasants during the Vietnam War could be viewed as rational problem solvers, aware of their own interests and ready to bargain with others to achieve a desired outcome. T. David Mason, in his article titled Insurgency, Counterinsurgency, and the Rational Peasant in the Public Choice Journal, noted that many analysts regard non-elite behavior as non-ideological, primarily apolitical, and concerned more with short-term damage limitation or benefit maximization than with preferences for particular institutional or ideological arrangements, for example, the establishment of communism, liberal democracy, or Sharia law within a territory preferred by competing elites. Sometimes non-elites are motivated both by material interests, for example, economics, security, or well-being, and ideological concerns, for example, identity, nationalism, ethnicity, or religion, but in cases of acute conflict, the former may take precedence. One despondent Palestinian woman whose house was destroyed by Israel during Operation Cast Lead observed, quote, "I will never vote for Hamas. They are not able to protect the people, and if they are going to bring this on us, why should they be in power? If I thought they could liberate Jerusalem, I would be patient, but instead they bring this on us." End quote. Additionally, McCormick observed that, with respect to popular support for violent groups, supportive members of a population can generally be classified as either committed supporters or opportunistic fence-sitters who wait on the sidelines to see which side comes out victorious. Generally speaking, the fence-sitters are more numerous. He stated, quote, "Every violent political contest is defined by a hardcore element on each side, whose members are prepared to stick to their guns regardless of which side is ahead. The effective support of the majority of the population, by contrast, typically depends on their subjective estimates of each side's prospects." End quote. In addition to forming a subjective estimate of each side's prospects, members of the general population must also estimate the likelihood that they will be subjected to violence if they support one side or another. Speaking of the decision to participate within a protest or demonstration, James DiNardo, in Power in Numbers, noted that, quote, "The generalized model of ideological recruiting assumes that potential demonstrators can anticipate the level of repression they will face and estimate the probability that it will be visited upon them. This probability surely depends on the repressive capacity of the regime, something that is generally known in most places, but also on the number of people who ultimately take to the streets." End quote. As suggested by DiNardo, The likelihood that a demonstrator will be subjected to violence varies inversely with the number of demonstrators. An increase in participation suggests that a movement has greater strength and therefore a greater capacity to withstand an incumbent government, and through sheer probability, an increase in numbers indicates that any one individual is less likely to be targeted with violence. Although DiNardo's analysis is in the context of deciding whether to participate in a social movement, considering an escalation of tactics, it applies even more to whether or not an individual chooses to support a violent insurgent movement against an incumbent government. In summation, we see that a rational choice perspective suggests that individuals are weakly rational in the sense of being capable of engaging in cost-benefit calculations that tie ends and means, and at times may offer a useful perspective through which to understand decision-making in conflicts. Furthermore, weak rationality is not limited to elite decision-making, but may also extend to non-elites as well. However, there are other perspectives through which to view insurgent leaders' decision-making. McCormick noted that decision-making can also be viewed from an organizational frame, in which organizational concerns weigh heavily on the decision to use violence. For instance, he noted that the intense need for secrecy that is a distinguishing feature of terrorist groups has the potential to alienate such groups from their larger political and social settings. This risk also applies to violent resistance movements more generally, and the concern is that, under such conditions, violent resistance movements become more hidebound as their decision-making becomes more rigid, closed, and inward-looking. Additionally, groups may also be prone to groupthink, in which pressure for decision-makers to agree impacts their ability to evaluate options. Lastly, groups may also find themselves in competition with other violent resistance movements for popular support, thus forcing them to engage in violence to win public approval, as opposed to worrying about the loss of support that may come with the use of violence. This may be the case if a public desires revenge against another group or governing authority, and various groups may therefore compete with one another to provide what is essentially a public good. Such a process has been termed outbidding, and will be discussed later in the next section. Lastly, a counterpoint to the strategic frame is that group actions at times may not be motivated by the pursuit of a strategic goal, but rather by idiosyncratic moral calculations. For instance, Martin Libicki, Peter Schock, and Melanie Sisson, in their book Exploring Terrorist Targeting Preferences, suggested that some al-Qaeda actions may be motivated by a moral calculus whereby the group perceives that its actions are sanctified by Allah and conducted in the pursuit of justice, which provides a sufficient reason for using violence. We discuss other decision-making paradigms in the conclusion. Despite these objections and qualifications, however, the strategic frame may prove to be a useful starting point as we subsequently consider the decision-making process of insurgent leaders and concerned publics regarding the use of violence by violent resistance movements.